Hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session of the Age of Uncertainty with the legendary ANDREI SOLDATOV. Hooray! So we call the festival this year the Age of Uncertainty, and one of our primary reasons for doing that was the events of February this year, when you had the full Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine and the attempted seizure of Kyiv, and all the events that have followed as a consequence, which has really taken us into a different world and a different level, I would argue, of uncertainty. We have heard quite a lot so far, and we will hear more about how this has impacted on Ukraine. But in this session, we want with ANDREI to concentrate on what the impact has been in Russia. ANDREI SOLDATOV is one of Russia's best-known independent journalists, working on a variety of issues, and not just in journalism, but writing books on the security services in Russia, on Russian emigration, on the use of technology in Russia, on a whole raft of subjects, which he's done extremely successfully. He's now, I think it's probably safe to say, reluctant to return under the present circumstances to the Russian Federation itself, which is good news for us because it means we have the benefit of his wisdom on so many levels. ANDREI, I expect this is going to be quite an intense session, and I think it's probably worth starting with the events of yesterday and Putin's announcement of the annexation by the Russian Federation of the 4 oblasts in Ukraine. This, of course, having happened to Crimea somewhat earlier. And at the same time, the encirclement of Liman on the border of Kharkiv and Luhansk provinces, oblast. This seems to me to be another critical point in this conflict. How would you describe the significance of what we've seen over the past 24 hours and what its implications are?
Well, thank you, Misha. Thank you for having me. But before we start, I just wanted to say one thing, if I may. There might be people in this audience who wonder why to have a Russian on the stage, given all what Russia is doing right now, as we speak, in Ukraine and also elsewhere. Or to put it more bluntly, why should we listen to you when you fail to get rid of Putin? Which is a hard question. And I've been, as Misha said, I've been working as an investigative journalist for more than 20 years. And I got my problems with the FSB already in 2002, which is 20 years ago. Yet we and I failed to win over the Russian public and Russian public opinion, at least so far. But I still believe that it is important to have Russians to speak, at least for one reason, just to say that and to show that non-Putin Russia, the other Russia, does exist. We just exist. And well, now I will try to answer your question about the last 24 hours. Of course, it's a significant development given the speech Vladimir Putin gave and the way it was framed. We all suspected that it was never about Ukraine, Ukraine obviously has this emotional significance for many in the country, and Putin knows how to play with these feelings. But for Putin personally, it was always about his feeling of insecurity. And of course, he understands that his main enemy is the West. So what he did actually, he spent less time talking about Ukraine or the annexed territories, but he wanted to tell you his version of the world history, basically, starting with Anglo-Saxons, I think. And that was, well, I spoke with some of my friends who are still in Moscow, and they took it as a big, big warning that this guy is extremely serious about his threats, and we need to take him really seriously when he talks in such apocalyptic terms. That is why it is important. I think, unfortunately, his ideas about the role of Russia and his big struggle with the West is getting more and more irrational. And of course, the events in Ukraine and the defeat, the Russian troops suffering in the oblast of, in the region of Liman, was also just added to this emotional significance of this moment. But I would say just one positive thing. So far, and we see that with mobilization, Vladimir Putin had three options before announcing mobilization. He could either destroy or try to destroy all national infrastructure in Ukraine. He could have used nuclear, or he could listen to his military and start this mobilization, which of course went really, really wrong. But nevertheless, he decided to stick with the option given by his military, which is, in his world, means that he still wants to control what is going on. And that gives me some hope.
So, if we look at the dynamics of the moment, he seems to be confident that the Russian people are either prepared to go along with what's happening or are actually keen to back him. Have there been any signs? We saw just a couple of weeks ago the meeting in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. We saw what was obviously serious criticism by the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, regarding the course of the war in Ukraine. We saw clear snubs by Central Asian leaders towards Putin. He no longer controls the peace process between Azerbaijan and Armenia. There's a war that's broken out between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. So clearly he's losing control, or his influence is diminishing there. There was the seeming unrest in Dagestan around the mobilization, and there was some internal criticism, notably in the councillors in St. Petersburg and Moscow. And yet his response to all of this, along with the military defeats in Kharkiv, his response to all of this appears to be to double down. Is that because he's frightened, or is it because he is confident, notwithstanding all these events?
I think he's extremely angry. I don't think he is losing touch with reality. I don't think so. He seemed very confident, and he is, unfortunately, he's not insane, but he's extremely angry. So his way to reestablish control and to remind everybody, at least in the country, who is in control, is to start this mobilization. Because, of course, mobilization is not only about getting people to the front line. It's also about how to make everybody think that nobody is safe anymore, in the country, and we talk about people in their 20s, in their 40s, in their 60s. We have people mobilized in their 60s. So it looks like a complete mess. But unfortunately, it also has this intimidation effect on people. Because right now, people cannot think of a bigger picture. What they think now, they're forced to think. They need to think about their immediate problems, immediate circumstances, about their relatives, about their friends, how to get them out of the country. The good question is for how long Putin want to have this happening, I mean this mobilization, well, at least at this stage. If, say, he would well, finish tomorrow, what would happen with the Russian public opinion? Because it looks like the very first victim of his mobilization is his control over the information space in the country. We all believed for years that he stayed in power for so long because people, the Russian population, well, watched his television, and it was under complete control. Putin also had built a really big system of internet censorship, and now it completely collapsed. This system was built back in 2018, 2019, with the idea to suppress the traffic from regions if something is happening in the regions, and to address specifically a problem of video, because video is likely to provoke more emotional reaction and possibly unrest or revolution than, say, text. And that's exactly what is going on right now. We have all these videos coming from the regions, and the biggest problem of the Russian internet censorship now is they cannot cope with the sheer size of the crisis. So that thing already collapsed. We have people in villages and small towns, not only in St. Petersburg and Moscow, watching nervously all these videos, trying to understand what to do, where to go, and they cannot trust Russian television. And it already has an effect on the Russian television. Russian TV hosts are getting more critical because they understand that they are losing trust of the Russian audience. So they need to say something about mobilization. And in these circumstances, I think it's a very new development for Putin. It's a very new situation. He never faced this before.
Andrei, this is a really fascinating insight of yours, which hadn't occurred to me before, that he is losing control of his monopoly over information, which has been so important for him for so long. If we think back to Afghanistan and the motivation for the end to the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, one of the key reasons for that was the so-called mothers movement, of the fact that they were getting unhappy about their children being killed and with no explanation and so on and so forth. If you're correct on this idea of he's losing control of the monopoly of the media, and you have, I would say, a significant greater number of casualties coming from Ukraine that you had out of Afghanistan, surely wouldn't this amount to an existential threat to Putin's strategy? Or are they still too frightened? I mean, can we tease this out a bit as to why we don't see, apart from in limited areas like Dagestan with its specific issues, we don't see a greater spread of protest? Or is it happening and we're just not seeing it?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's not that optimistic. What is different from what we saw back in the 1980s with the war in Afghanistan is that with new movements like Soldiers' Mothers and all that, they were allowed by the authorities, by Gorbachev. So it was a sanctioned civic activity. And the repressive apparatus of the Soviet Union was, of course, extremely large. But it's not comparison with what we have now. The other interesting thing is that the war in Afghanistan didn't affect the Soviet security services. We had some developments inside. For instance, the KGB formed the special forces groups, again, to operate in Afghanistan. But what we see now with Ukraine, we see a complete and titanic reshuffle of the Russian security services. And if before the war we compared the FSB, the major Russian security service, to the KGB, these days we need to compare it with something much darker, with Stalin's secret services. Especially the way the military counterintelligence operates in the occupied territories. All these filtration camps, that tradition comes from the late 1940s. What we saw in Western Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, it's a very traditional thing for Stalin's secret services. So they are getting much more brutal, much more militarized than what we had back in the 1980s. The amount of repressions we can see, and we already see, and the brutality reminds me of what happened 2 years ago in Belarus. Just last week, we got a guy, a poet in Moscow, who had his apartment raided by police, and he was raped in his apartment. And his girlfriend was forced to watch it. We've never seen that before. So that's how things developing. And my biggest problem with the optimism is, unfortunately, when you see this kind of brutality, it might be really difficult to try to build some grassroots movement and to get something out of these protests we have now. Still, there are some options, of course. We all understand Dagestan is a very, very difficult region to control. All the terrorist attacks we had in, not all of them, but most of them we had in the late 2000s and 2010s, that was Dagestan. So it's a very difficult region. They have problems with neighbors, and if, say, Putin decides to send some Chechens in to suppress revolt, well, that might start as a big problem between these two regions. But unfortunately, it's a far cry from a revolution in Moscow.
And what about the concept of the so-called Ceausescu moment? One could call it the Ceausescu moment or the Milosevic moment, where parts of his relatively close elite and security forces decide that he is becoming a liability to their interests. Are there any signs that that might be a possible trajectory, or are they completely subordinate to his will, as far as we can tell?
Well, first of all, Russian security services are very unlike what, say, Egypt has, or Syria, Turkey. There was never a really big underground movement in Russian or Soviet security services. They did not know how to do that. We also have a problem of trust. Remember that in 1991, when the putsch failed in Moscow, it failed not because of all the Muscovites who came to the streets and protested, but because rank and file of the KGB failed to support the leadership of the KGB. And we still have this problem. They do not know how to build trust within the FSB. They're quite suspicious of each other. They also do not know how to distribute properly all the money they have access to. It's not like Egypt, and that is why like officers like majors and colonels, they do not trust and they actually hate their generals. It's not actually the ground you want to have if you want to start building a coup. The other problem is that if you want to do something like a coup, you need some political support. And we had these in the 1990s. Some governors were against Yeltsin, some political parties we had. Back then, even the Communist Party was quite, well, I would say they probably would support something like that. And also, you need to have some popular generals. What Putin has been doing all these months, he was making sure that this war would not produce popular generals. We don't know the names of people who actually run this war. We have Minister Shoigu, who has no military background, no military training. He's not respected within the military. We also have the chief of the general staff, who is a bit more respected, but he's not, I would say, a guy who would be acting independently. Gerasimov, yes. But we do not know the names of the people who are on the battlefield. And that is, well, I would say, a very systematic effort from the Kremlin.
So we saw at the beginning of the invasion that it didn't go the way that that Putin intended. It's agreed upon fairly widely that he had believed in the 4 to 5 day taking of Kyiv, and then the Zelensky government would collapse, and so on. So this must have been a huge shock, not just to Putin, but to a lot of people in Russia, that the invincible Red Army was not as invincible as they all thought. Indeed, it turned out to be hugely incompetent in many ways. So given that and the mobilization, are we now assuming that Putin's fundamental strategy is just to throw hundreds of thousands, even millions of men into the meat grinder of Ukraine? Is that the fundamental military strategy he's left with, or are there other options?
Well, the interesting thing that, yes, he had this plan before February 24th, and the most interesting thing for me is that he failed to change this plan for almost 7 months. For all these months, basically what we saw the same plan just being patched with some add-on elements, but it was basically the same thing. And he's still calling it a special military operation, and not only for propaganda reasons, because actually he believed in this idea. But what, unfortunately, is the feeling in the country, and it benefits Putin, is that it's so humiliating to feel that you are getting defeated by the Ukrainians, that this idea is not accepted by the society. Instead, what you have a big idea that we went into this war, but actually it is not a war with Ukraine, it is a war with the West. And because it's such a big thing, you have the whole of the West against one country, so it doesn't matter how many casualties you have, because you have the entire world against you. And as Putin said in his speech, yesterday, that has been the case all these centuries. We always had this country surrounded by enemies, attacking it from every angle. And that is why we need to get ready to sustain more casualties. And to a large extent, people accept that. The interesting thing that also you have, of course, the military pushing Putin, saying, look, you made us look a fool to attacking Ukraine with such a small number of people. Now the Ukrainians are superior, not only in terms of technology supplied by the West, but also in terms of numbers. We just cannot fight this way. We need people, which makes some sense, militarily speaking. So you have some support in the society, and you have also support in the military. The most pessimistic thing is that we all see these pictures and videos that the people they mobilize, they are not professional, they are not competent, they are not trained properly, and we think that it's a sign of desperation and collapse. It is not. What the Russian military think they still have really capable units, but being completely misused because they lack ordinary infantry units. So they do not ask for more professional units. They need just people, just to hold the line. And they believe that when they get these people, they can finally use properly the Spetsnaz forces, VDV forces, all these professional units they still have. So for a time being, I would say all these disastrous pictures, well, put aside, the military are quite okay with what is going on.
Right. So the implications of what you're saying is we are in for many, many more months, if not years, of war, because the successes of Ukraine in the north militarily are likely to be temporary, in as much that the military will now have the manpower, the Russian military, it has been asking for, in order to hold the line and possibly push back the Ukrainian army again?
Yeah, I fear that it could be the most possible scenario, unfortunately.
And what about the issue of the possible deployment of a nuclear weapon? Do you think that this is Putin merely trying to unsettle the West? Or is he actually trying to indicate to the United States and Europe that he is actively considering a deployment of a nuclear weapon?
I think the most dangerous thing here is that Putin believes that he has a plan, and that is why he is in control. But actually, he's not, and he doesn't understand that. Last week, we saw a lot of pro-Kremlin, pro-war journalists and propagandists sharing one particular video. It was made in August 2014, and there was Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who was a kind of a Russian version of Trump, making a speech in presence of Putin that we need to recruit prisoners and send them to war in Ukraine. And Putin was laughing. And it was clear from the footage from this video that Putin thought this idea was absolutely like a crazy idea, and Zhirinovsky was seen as a clown in the Russian politics. But now, these days, all these war correspondents, they think it was a great idea, and Zhirinovsky was actually right. But what is terrifying to me is just to think that 8 years ago, in 2014, Vladimir Putin thought that something was absolutely unthinkable, and now he's doing exactly that. We have people recruited in prisons. That means that there is no plan in his mind. He's always tactical. And that means that if some circumstances would be not really good for him, he might come up with some other idea, some new idea. Okay, maybe to do that, maybe to do this. And this mobilization might be, well, if, say, the military tomorrow say, no, it's not enough. Again, that is the problem with a guy who always thinks tactically.
I want to talk about something which isn't discussed very often, partly because we're still deep in the middle of this war. But if we look forward to when the war has finished, regardless of how it's finished, how do other countries in Central Europe, in Western Europe, in the United States, how do these countries engage with Russia? Because Russia, whatever the outcome of this war is, will still have almost half the world's stockpile of nuclear weapons. So you're dealing with a country and a society where the rules are basically different for that one fundamental reason, if nothing else. How do you see the future of Russia and its engagement with the West after this is over?
Of course, we all see this big push for isolation, and I absolutely understand the emotions here. That, of course, some might think it just would be better just to close the door, but unfortunately, it cannot be done. You have 140 million people there. It's a big country. It always will be there. So there should be some strategy, some idea accepted by many countries, first of all in Europe, what to do with this country. And I think we all should understand, even if it's very emotionally difficult, that we need to re-engage Russia. It's impossible to isolate it completely. And I still believe that we still have lots of good people outside of the country, but also inside. They feel absolutely, I understand the sufferings of Ukrainians are just no comparison to what the Russians are facing with. But just imagine the country, and maybe it's good to talk about this thing here in Austria. Just imagine a country where you have the thinking part of the society feeling completely lost because the past of the country, the history of Russia, now feels to us completely compromised because of all these imperial exploits, all the horrible things which were done by the Russian Empire in the 18th century, in the 19th century, the way we think about the Russian Empire. The Russian present, well, feels absolutely horrible, but also the future. So we have no standing, not in our past, not in our present, not in our future. We feel completely confused. That is why we have some Russians thinking that we need to rethink completely everything about Russian, for instance, about Russian flag. This is a sign of desperation, because nobody understands what to do, how to think about your country. The problem here is that if so many people get confused, it's easier for some populists to give them some idea that, look, nobody loves you, and okay, so we understand what comes next.
Do you think that the way the West, and NATO countries in particular, has approached and responded to the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the right response? Is it going in the right direction? And are you confident that it would, if that is so, that it will be able to maintain that direction itself domestically, internally, as it were?
I think that the military strategy, providing military help to Ukraine, I think it was absolutely right, and it is the right strategy. And what we all need to find and help to do is to help Ukraine to win this war. That's absolutely clear. What to do next and how to re-engage, how to talk to these people, how to talk to the country, it's a different matter. Because not only the Russians feel completely confused, everybody gets completely confused. I mean, I just went back from the States, almost in every big university in the States, you have some people who are experts in Russian studies, and all of them are confused because so many things now look completely different with this new perspective. Well, we don't know what to think about the Second World War anymore. We used to believe that, the Soviet troops did horrible things, but still they were on the right side of the history. And that sort of justified many things afterwards. Not anymore. And so the whole idea, the whole concept, how we see the country, it's just collapsed. again, not only for the Russians, but also for people in the West. I think it would take years to find a way, and I don't think that anybody has an answer right now.
Andrei, I don't think I've ever had a conversation with you in which you've sounded as despondent, if I can put it like that, as you are this afternoon. And I wonder whether if you, with your insights, with your network in the West and inside Russia, if you're feeling despondent, how does that, how do ordinary Russians, let's say the Russian diaspora in Europe at the moment, feel about their existence? Because obviously the sympathy for the Ukraine is understandably very, very high. Are we seeing a sort of collective trauma amongst Russians as well that we aren't perhaps able to identify quite as easily as the obvious trauma that Ukrainians are suffering?
Yes, absolutely. In the beginning of the war, when we got so many people out of the country, when we got this first wave of emigration, there were lots of conversations among Russian immigrants that we need to find a way how to have a conversation about the future of the country. And for that, we need to have some institutions, maybe some sort of Russian university in exile. And of course, now, with the war getting more and more ugly, this kind of prospect seems to be very distant. The other problem is that the Russians also, all the time, hear this very emotional argument, not only from the Ukrainians, but also from people rightly outraged by what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, that maybe it's time for you to shut up. We hear you for too long. And it's not, we don't care about what you say and what you talk about. The problem is that you just cannot produce a new narrative for your country if you are not talking about it, right? So we still need to have this conversation. And this conversation should be not only within the Russian community, it should be also with the world. We do not want to strengthen this myth of the country being absolutely unique. That's what Putin knows how to exploit. And to be honest, it's such a big thing. Even now, I know from my conversations with my friends, that if you have anyone trying to find some historical comparisons, it's always about the Russian past. It's never about other countries' experiences. We always talk, if we talk about the prospects of the revolution, we always talk about 1917. We never talk about the revolutions in other countries. Never, ever. If we talk about the protest, again, it's about 2011, 2012. We do not talk about the Arab Spring. We don't have this in our experience. And I think it's part of the problem, because if you have this idea that this country was always unique, it makes all other lessons being absolutely unapplicable to Russia. It looks like this country is just doomed. You cannot do anything with it. I mean, it's not, well, you know all these arguments. This country never seen any democracy ever. They were always like that, so let's stay them this way. Unfortunately, we live on one planet, and we need to find a way how to re-engage all the countries in the world, including Russia.
Andrei, thanks very much. I'm going to throw it open to the audience now for the last 20 minutes. I dare say there'll be quite a number of questions. I think, is that Fred Studeman I see far away in the distance?
Hi there. Thank you for an astonishing discussion. I don't think despondent quite fully covers it as far as I'm concerned. Very chilling, but thank you. I wanted to ask if you could unpack a little bit more about China. I mean, Misha mentioned right at the start, there's what happened in Samarkand, and the influence that whole relationship may have on how Russia acts going forward.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Lots of people right now in Moscow ask themselves this very question, because because the sanctions made it absolutely impossible to rely on Western technologies. And well, we had this thing, import substitution, for quite some years, and it was a government policy. But unfortunately, or fortunately, it doesn't work. And still, the Russian government, and we should understand that Russia is hugely digitized, much more digitized than, say, many European countries. And the reason for that is that the Kremlin believed for years that, yes, we had these problems with inefficient bureaucracy, but it could be fixed by digital methods. That is why billions were invested in digitalization of government services. And of course, now this is the weak point, where you can get your new servers, where you can get your new software, how you can update it, where you can train your people. It's a big question. They cannot get it from the West, so they're trying to get it from China. As far as I see right now, China is very reluctant to provide all this help. We see some big companies like Huawei closing their offices, opening them again, closing them again. So it's very, I would say, the Chinese do not want to commit themselves to help the Russians to rebuild their digital infrastructure. But I think it's inevitable. We already see that Russian companies, telecommunication companies specifically, they're trying to smuggle some stuff from China using all kinds of roads. And they have no other choice. They're trying to rely on open software. And what is not helping here is, again, some of the Western sanctions. For instance, we got this visa ban. And what we got is that many IT engineers who wanted to flee and to move out of Russia now believe that because they are not welcome anymore, they need to make their career choice. And we already have some horrible examples of people, like just to give you one name, Alexei Lukatsky, for instance. He's a legend in Russian cyber world. He has been active in cyber since 1992. Always was extremely liberal, always kept his distance from the Russian security services. And he was a public face of Cisco in Russia. After the war started, after a few months, and actually in July, he decided to join Positive Technology. And Positive Technologies is a Russian company which is under US sanctions for helping the FSB and GRU to recruit new hackers. So just imagine this trajectory. So you have a guy who started as a face of American technologies in the country, but just because he believes that he has no choice but to stay in the country, now he's helping Russian cyber offensive capabilities. And that is the problem we have now, with lots of people who cannot leave the country. And of course, again, they would rely more and more on the Chinese, whether the Chinese want it or not.
So just following on that, a question, a big area which I forgot to ask you was how sanctions and Chinese partial recognition of sanctions, how is that impacting on the Russian economy? And is that going to be a factor in terms of how Russians respond to the future course of the war?
Well, I would say the big surprise for everybody, especially, I would say, people who think that they are experts in economy, that the Russian economy is actually doing quite well. It's not collapsing right now. And even digital services provided by the government are still provided. For instance, they had some problems last month with issuing new passports. They fixed them. In the long run, yes, of course it would be a disaster. They have no way how to replace the shipments of microchips from Taiwan or from the Netherlands. And they do not know how to build big systems, software systems, especially database systems. They have some other big problems, but they would see them only probably next year, not right now. So I do not see any I don't think that it would affect how the war is going on right now.
Right. Do you, by the way, let's see, any more questions from the floor? Yes, at the back, at the very back, there was...
Thank you very much. Olesa Kromychuk. So the world's been anxiously waiting for 7 months to see some Russian protests inside the country and failed to see those until recently when some people objected to being mobilized, and that was very quickly labeled as anti-war protests when in fact they were not. They were anti-mobilization protests. Since then, a lot of Russians left the country, with some estimates suggest about 300,000, roughly the number that Putin actually wanted to mobilize. So they're out of reach of the Russian state, because that was used as, one of the reasons, this is a police state, it's really difficult to protest inside the country. Yesterday, Putin tried to annex more Ukrainian territory. Have you seen any large-scale protests happening, being arranged by the Russians outside of Russia? Because I haven't, and if you haven't either, why not?
Well, first of all, we have had anti-war protests immediately after February 24. Probably you know that we have 16,000 people arrested and detained by the Russian police in February, in March, in April, in May. Many of these people were sent to jail. I have friends who are now in jail because of the anti-war stance. I can give you the names. Vladimir Karamurza, who decided to come back to Russia from Washington, basically to go to jail, because he said that he believed that this war was a crime. We have Ilya Yashin, also my friend, who is in jail right now. We have lots and lots of people. As I said, 16,000 people were arrested before the mobilization. So I don't think you are quite right saying that the Russians are not protesting. Yes, we failed, as I said in the beginning, to get rid of Putin. And I think we have the same problem in Belarus when you have, and I think, to be honest, the example of Belarus was even more difficult, because in Belarus you had like 80% of the country against Lukashenko, and yet the protest failed. I think what we should understand is the brutality of the regime is absolutely unprecedented. We've never seen that before. Only, I would say, 2 years. Yeah, last 2 years we are quite, well, different from even what we saw before. And that's my answer. And when you say that Russians outside of the country, they are not doing anything, it's not also exactly right. I have lots of friends in Berlin who, the Russian exiles, who left the country before the war started. And they spent these months in Berlin helping the Ukrainian refugees. I also have friends in Montenegro. We have a big effort helping Ukrainian refugees to settle in Montenegro. It's run by the Russians, by my friends, Alexander Shmelyov and Sveta Shmelyova. That's what we have. In London, we had groups of Russian exiles coming to Trafalgar Square to protest alongside with the Ukrainians. I was there. It was difficult emotionally. Well, that's what we have. Unfortunately, I cannot give you millions.
Sir, here in the second row.
Thank you very much indeed for this most fascinating presentation. I have just a question about power structure. Actually, Putin has absolute power more than any other Russian leader since Stalin, obviously. And I just wonder about the structure, like FSB is under his total control. Military doesn't play an important role, it seems, in political power. And what about the Wagner Group? It's also within the structure, just for special activities. And the Kadyrovtsi, this is maybe the only group a little bit more independent of Kadyrov. So how do you see this whole power structure? Thank you.
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. The FSB has a major role in conducting repressions. At the same time, they are not completely independent. And actually, they are less so starting in 2016. the military were getting more and more ambitious, and they were given more powers, mostly because Putin believed that the FSB failed him several times, including in Ukraine in 2014. That is why he believed that the military can deliver where the FSB could not. But when the war started, of course, the FSB had its problems because they were in charge of providing intelligence about the political situation in Ukraine, and they completely miscalculated, as we all know. But nevertheless, Putin believes that he cannot, these people, well, he still needs them, and he found them a new role. So now the FSB is in charge of several things, and they are really crucial during the time of the war. First, you have this big, the largest actually department of the FSB, the military counterintelligence department, in charge of two things, of making sure that the troops are staying loyal, and that means spying in every military unit in the country, fighting or not fighting, in Ukraine or outside of it. And also, these are the people who are in charge of running filtration camps for Ukrainian civilians. And that means that they are in charge of establishing political control in the occupied territories. It gives them enormous powers, because that also means that they are not only suppressing people. Filtration camps, they are not only for conducting repressions, they are also for recruiting people. Because when you have lots of people processing in filtration camps, it's the best ground to recruit people. And they learned that back in the 1940s, and also they did that in Chechnya. So the FSB has quite a specific role. And actually, when we looked at the structure, I would say by May and June, it looks like before the war, only two departments of the FSB were involved in the Ukrainian affairs. The Fifth Service, the intelligence, and to some extent the counterintelligence, because we were hunting down Ukrainian spies and harassing Ukrainian journalists in Moscow. Now every department of the FSB is involved. Even the Economic Security Department, guys who are usually harass the Russian oligarchs, they are now in charge of harassing Russian doctors because they should prescribe Russian-made medicine instead of Western medicine, and it's a part of import substitution thing. And they attack people, they spy on them, they organize criminal cases against them. And you have counterterrorism department being active. You have everybody active. And also they send people, to the occupied territories on 3 months basis duty tours. So Putin wants to have everybody in the FSB being involved. And that gives them this stance. The military, I would say that now they're getting more active because the war is getting more conventional. If I can use this word. So you have the military intelligence being more active, of course. But I would not overestimate the independence of Kadyrov and Wagner. Wagner, since 2017, has been part of the military intelligence. So there is a special department inside, which is in charge of supervising private military companies, including Wagner. Kadyrov also, he's part of the National Guard. And he needs to talk to Zolotov all the time, and it's difficult for him, especially because his Chechens, they failed to produce significant results in Ukraine, and also because the mobilization stalled in Chechnya, which is quite embarrassing for Kadyrov. So I would say, just in a nutshell, Putin used this war to establish more control and to tighten control over his military and the security services. There is no independence there.
I see at the back there the hand waving now.
Hi, thank you, Andrei, very much for this interesting talk. My name is Tessa Szyszkowicz, I'm a journalist. In the debate about the palace coup option, I'm wondering, usually experts think that Putin might be replaced by someone more radical, like Nikolai Patrushev. And I would like to know if you think that any change would be good, even of a more radical person, because once this system Putin falls, then the whole thing could come down.
Yeah, we all have this hope, you know. It's like, that's why so many people in Russia, they are watching very carefully every public appearance of Putin, trying to identify some signs that maybe he's getting ill or sick or something. Unfortunately, we're just very desperate. But, well, I hope you're right. I hope you're right, and the system relies only on his personality, and it would collapse immediately. There are some promising signs to that. For instance, when Vladimir Putin appointed his bodyguards to run some Russian regions, mostly these people, they are not extremely good. I mean, they are so bad. They are not properly trained. They're just bodyguards. So they are not really effective as managers as he thought of them. So I would say here you have some hope, but unfortunately the other option that we might get, someone who are much more radical. Unfortunately, it's also an option.
And I saw somebody there, and then I think that'll probably be it. So if you'd both like to ask your questions.
Thank you so much for having you here and giving us the opportunity for this kind of dialogue. It's so great to have this. And I would like to come back to the here and now and to your first question to opening the discussion. And I'm asking as a just interested and scared public. Yeah? We have this moment of the annexion and the referendums now. And my question is, on one side, what does it change on the legal level if there are now the wars going on in these areas, on one hand, and on the other hand, we have at the same time, we had yesterday Ukraine's demand to become member of the NATO, something we always wanted to avoid. So we have a tension on both sides and also on the legal side. And how do we get out of this, or what kind of strategies do you see? Thanks.
Well, I'm trying to stay optimistic, so I think, well, I hope that it might be close to reality, that what Putin wanted to achieve with this annexation and referendums, he wanted to improve his position in negotiations with Ukraine. And it looks like he wanted it. And Lavrov hinted on this opportunity some months ago, saying basically that you need to start talking to us now, because later we would grab more territory and it would be more difficult for you, which sounds like a very stupid strategy to force someone into negotiation. So it looks like they want it, which is a good sign. So we want to talk. So they do not feel themselves so confident as we want to project, which probably is a good sign. To be honest, I don't think that I'm in position to comment on the Zelensky announcement about joining NATO. Basically because as a journalist, I'm not really comfortable to talk about something I do not know, and I was not able to go to Ukraine, though I tried as a journalist. It's not really easy for completely understandable reasons for people with Russian passports to get to Ukraine, even if you are journalists and they are in exile. So I have no comment on that.
I'm truly sorry, but oh yes, no, we are going to try one more question very quickly.
Just a quick question. You described how Putin convinced himself that this is a war against all of the West and not just a quick and painless land grab in the Ukraine as he originally intended to. Do you see a risk that he is trying to actively involve more Western countries in the war against all military logic?
We all feared that in the beginning. I mean, that is why the Baltics became so worried, rightfully so. Maybe you remember that in April, some Russian generals, especially one guy, was extremely open about his ambitions. He said that we need to grab some part of Moldova, and he talked about Transnistria. We all remember that. It never happened, which is a good sign, at least for now. And that's it. I'm not an insider of in his inner circle.
I hope you'll join me in giving Andrei a very warm round of applause. This has been a very important session, in my opinion. There's a lot of lessons we can take home from it. Not all very optimistic, I'm afraid, but I'm extremely pleased that Andrei, in these difficult times for everyone, is able to carry out his work as a journalist and a thinker with as much exactitude and courage as he has done throughout his time in Russia itself. Thank you very much, Andrei.
Thank you.